You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. You know, every once in a while, we like to do what I call a palate cleanser and get away from Gettysburg for a bit. But I always like to try to, if possible, keep at least a pinky toe in Gettysburg. And so here we are combining Band of Brothers and Gettysburg. How do we do that? Well, it's because of one of our guests, Erik Dorr, who has the Gettysburg Museum of History, and his co-author here, Jared Frederick, on this book called Fierce Valor, the true story of Ronald Spiers and his band of brothers. Captain Spiers, you remember him? He was the crazy one, but he was really cool. Everybody loved him and feared him at the same time. And so that's what we're talking about today. And you can see a lot of Easy Company stuff in Erik's museum. Is that correct, Erik?
That is correct. We have the world's largest collection of Easy Company artifacts.
So you would be, is it safe to say that you are the Easy Company headquarters of the world as far as artifacts go?
I guess when it comes to artifacts, you could say that, yes.
Good, very good. And Jared Frederick, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Now, your voice has been on our feed before, our free feed, when you did a winter lecture here this past winter. But this is the first time that you're actually a guest of the show.
Correct.
And you are beside yourself with excitement. Right?
I am. I'm very excited to be here.
Okay. So whose idea was it to do this book?
Well, that was my idea, and Jared and I did another book called Hang Tough, and was based on Major
Donnie
Dick.
Wahlberg. Yeah.
It was based on Major Dick Winter's letters, which we have in our archives at the museum. And, one of the other things we had in the archives, besides Winter's letters, were a lot of letters between Winters and some of the men of Easy Company, and also Stephen Ambrose, who created the book Band of Brothers. So I went through those. When I first got the files of Dick Winters, the first file I pulled was Ronald Speirs, because he's always been, I've always been fascinated with Ronald Speirs. And
what is it that fascinated you about him?
Because he's such a tough guy, and he just seemed like,
just crazy.
Just like the kind of guy that you probably want to be fighting with, because he just seemed like, he was very, very gung-ho and
almost like a movie action hero.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But real life.
Real life. And so in those files were a lot of letters between Winters and Ambrose and Spiers. Ambrose tried to kind of interview him a little bit, and there's a little bit of an interview. But really what happened was, as the book developed, Major Winters and Ronald Speirs corresponded, and little bits came out, and a lot of it was later on when they tried to convince him, Speirs, to do the interview section in the HBO series, and Winters really wanted him to do that, and he was not interested in it. But it was a lot of great stuff. There was also some other paperwork in there, including a really interesting account that he wrote about the Battle of Carentan that he wrote later on when he was in the Army. And it was just absolutely fascinating. So after we did Hang Tough, I wanted to do a follow-up, and so I messaged Jared, and I said, hey, what do you think about doing a book about Speirs? And he was like, well, I don't know, what do you have? So I sent him what I had, and which was all these letters and some other stuff. There was other stuff in there besides just the correspondence. There was, some after action reports and things like that. And he digested it for a while. And what was your thought, Jared?
It was first very imposing, because at first I was also a little bit afraid to delve into the life of Major Dick Winters as well, because, these are iconic people.
Yeah.
And, and I first saw Band of Brothers when I was in high school. And never in a million years would I have envisioned myself as being one of the biographers of some of these individuals. And so
that's kind of surreal, right?
It was very surreal. And I was flattered by the opportunity. But the selling point for me for both books was, once I had the opportunity to take a look at this correspondence, the primary sources, a lot of the military records that were within these various files, that made it very easy to convince me in the long run, because what they ultimately showed us, it was a fuller picture in a way, that we were able to connect a whole lot of the dots that perhaps the original book or the miniseries left open to the speculation of readers and viewers. And I thought that was a really exciting scholarly journey.
So what were your sources? You have letters. What else?
After action reports, files of some of the other men. But that was one of the things when Jared first got what I had in the files, or the main part. Right. He said, I don't know, Eric, you know, there's a lot of gaps here. And then I reminded him that when we wrote Hang Tough and did the text between the letters, we had to fill in those blanks also, because there's a lot of times in Hang Tough where major winners, you know, and that's based on correspondence of major winners. There's times when he was in a foxhole in Bastogne, or, you know, and he couldn't write. So there was long gaps. So I said to Jared, you know, hey, there's a lot of gaps, yes, in Ronald Speirs' career, but you know, we can use some other sources for that and tell the story. And so it'll just involve us doing some more research, and that's what we did.
You fill in the blanks from a 30,000 foot view if you have to, just because you don't have his actual Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so did you get to talk to anybody, or was it all just? Yeah, you did. Who?
Yes, there was one person in particular who I had a very interesting hours-long conversation with, and that was Colonel Ed Shames.
Okay.
Who is a very, very minor character in the miniseries Band of Brothers, but as it turns out, he was very good friends with Spiers. He saw a lot in common. They both saw themselves as outsiders within this company, and he was the last surviving officer of Easy Company. And unfortunately, he passed away last December.
Okay.
But the previous May, I believe it was, I had an hours-long phone conversation with him where I really got to pick his brain in depth on Ronald Speirs. And so that sort of insight was really, really invaluable.
So, I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, so it was the May before he died?
Actually, it was 2 Mays.
2 Mays before he died.
Passed
but
away,
still, that's kind of close.
Yes.
Like you almost, if you guys had waited a little longer to start this, you might not have gotten that.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty good. Okay, so tell us about Ronald Speirs. Where was he born? What was his life like before the war?
Well, Matt, one thing I also have to add, and before we forget to do it, is, you know, this book would not have been possible without another archive that we were granted access to, and that is the 101st Airborne scholar, World War II scholar Mark Bando, who interviewed over 1,000 101st Airborne paratroopers starting in the late 60s up until fairly recently. And he gave us access to his archives, including many interviews with people who were around Speirs. Particularly, there was one in particular, a guy named Jim DiMarzio. Art DiMarzio. We call him Jumbo, and that was his nickname. And there was a couple other guys that were in Speirs' dog company before he was even in Easy Company that was actually witness to some of the more controversial things that happened. So
you're talking about him shooting the prisoners?
Yeah, he so this guy actually was in Speirs' stick, you know, in the same plane, dropped on D-Day with him, and those guys fought together with Art DiMarzio up until he left Dog Company, but with another guy that was with him, the one that ended up getting shot, you know, they were together from June 6th, from the time they landed up until the time he got shot. So this other guy's account was spot on, and this interview was done a long time ago. There was an audio recording of him that was done, I believe, in the 80s, and then there was a video that was done maybe in the early 90s or something like that. And there was also another guy that was in Dog Company that Bando had not recorded, but he gave us his notes. And so this was gold, because here are guys that saw these events, not a guy that heard it from a guy that heard it from a guy,
right.
but actual guys that were standing there when it happened. So that was... You know, the book would not have been possible without getting access to Mark Bando's archive, and we thank him every time we can.
So you're talking not about him shooting the prisoners, but him shooting the sergeant. Is that what he was a witness to?
He was witness to both those.
Both, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all right, so we'll get to that more in depth later, but now let's go back. back to the beginning of his life. Where was he born? How old, or not how old was he when he was born, but what year was he born? And how did he get to join the Army?
Spiers was born April 20th, 1920, in actually Edinburgh, Scotland.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know that he was an immigrant school soldier. And ironically enough, he was born on Adolf Hitler's 31st birthday, which is an irony that did not escape him later in life. But his father had been involved in the armaments industry during World War I. And after the war to end all wars, quote unquote, came to an end, there was, a huge lack of need for the armaments industry.
Yeah.
And there was likewise recession in England, and that ultimately spurred his father to immigrate to the United States.
Okay.
He eventually moved to Boston, worked in the steel industry, and Ronald Spiers, his 4 older siblings, and his mother arrived in Boston, reunited with the father, Christmas of 1924. And we actually found a newspaper clipping of their arrival.
Really?
And it's probably the earliest known photograph of Ronald Spiers. He's in a little rain jacket with, knee-high knickers.
Right.
Looking very adorable and not like, the hard-nosed killer that a lot of people think him as. So that kind of grounded us a little bit because, it allowed us to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, this guy is human. He was a 4-year-old once. And so something like that is really helpful when you're trying to paint an accurate human portrait of a well-known historical individual.
So they come over here, and you said they're reunited. When he's about 4?
Mm-hmm.
And
They're separated for a year.
Mm-hmm. And where do they settle? In Boston?
Mm-hmm.
And they stay in Boston for the rest of their lives, the parents, or what do they do?
To my knowledge, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so from Boston, he goes and joins the Army when he gets older.
Correct.
No, he's drafted.
He is drafted.
See, I pay attention to your video.
Yes, indeed. Like 60% of Americans.
Yeah.
A lot of people, as we envision the World War II generation, we think of these selfless individuals, who join up to do the right thing. And as it turns out, the majority of them were told by Uncle Sam that they were going into the military.
Which really makes him
Spiers
more...
is among them.
It makes him more remarkable because, he fought like he wanted to be there, unless I'm wrong, unless the movie misrepresented him. Did it?
I don't think so.
I don't either, from what I'm hearing.
You got to remember, although he was drafted, he did volunteer for the paratroopers. That was a volunteer thing. Just the enlistment was drafting.
Okay, gotcha. So he volunteers for the paratroopers, and when he enters and everything like that, what is he? He becomes an officer right away, like everybody else. Like not everybody else, but like Winters and all these other guys. He comes out a lieutenant, or.
Yeah, what essentially happened is that he was finishing some collegiate level classes or, some certification classes. And that degree status allowed him to enter the United States Army as a second lieutenant.
Okay.
And so he had some military training when he was in high school. He was in an equivalent of junior ROTC. And so he had some grounding in the military by the time he formally enters in 1942. And so he had more military background than your average American teenager or 20-something kid.
Okay. And he's first put in Charlie Company?
Well, he first actually ends up in the 85th Infantry Division.
Oh.
And he ends up at Camp Shelby, Mississippi.
Okay. So he's not a Toccoa guy? Or he is?
He is eventually.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And to tie it back to Civil War stuff, Shelby Foote was in the same division, the same camp at the same time that Ronald Spiers was.
Interesting.
Yes,
okay.
Indeed. But he's only in the 85th for about 2 or 3 months when the 101st Airborne Division starts putting out a call for, potential recruits to earn their jump wings and participate in this experimental endeavor known as the Airborne. And that is ultimately what takes him to Camp Toccoa.
Okay, gotcha. So from there, go ahead. Tell us what he goes through when he gets over to Europe.
So after he goes through jump school in Toccoa and everything, they go over to England, and they're in a little town called Aldbourne, and billeted with people around there, and that's where Easy Company was also. And I guess, at that time he was in 1st Battalion of the 506 because he was still in C Company. And he got into his commanding officer had some issues with him being a so-called Yankee. He was a Southern officer. And right before D-Day, he got transferred into Dog Company, which was in 2nd Battalion. So he moved from 1st Battalion to 2nd Battalion. And the other thing that happened there was he started dating a local girl, and Spiers actually got married right before D-Day.
Okay.
And we have a photo in the book, and we have the original at the Gettysburg Museum of History of him and his wedding party and standing in front of the church in Aldbourne. And one of the other people in that photo is Buck Compton, who's famous from the book and series Band of Brothers. So, and, right after that, they jumped into D-Day, and, a few months later, a son was born to Ronald Spiers.
Oh, okay.
So he had a war bride.
And she was English,
Yes.
I'm assuming? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so they goes into D-Day. What does he participate in while during the D-Day campaign?
There's a lot to dive into there with that one. He and his stick, his plane full of paratroopers, a small cluster of them land in the vicinity of St. Mary Glees, which was this essential contested crossroads town that was absolutely vital for the Americans to secure in order to initiate the effort of ultimately linking up the American beachheads.
Right.
After he and his men land, rather than running toward the sound of the guns in St. Mary Glees, they actually turn northward toward the coast, because they have to assemble, their paratroopers, work toward their mission,
Right.
So on and so forth. And this gets us into the first of many contested stories or controversies about Spiers, because shortly after they landed, this is when he and two of his fellow paratroopers encounter three German soldiers who are walking down the road. They may have, in fact, even been conscripted troops of another country, for all we know. But apparently these three German prisoners were rather oblivious to the fact that the invasion was ongoing. Who knows what they thought was happening. But Spiers and his two men overpowered these three Germans, seized their weapons, and were able to subdue them very, very easily. And shortly thereafter, a line of communication opens up. And Spiers himself did not smoke. That's one of the great myths about him.
Did he offer them cigarettes?
The two other men start giving the prisoners cigarettes in order to calm them down. And what they're trying to do is to open a line of communication, probably in all likelihood get their geographic bearing, find out exactly where they are.
Okay.
And this is when Spiers turns toward his two men, and he rather grimly says, "We can't take them with us." And the reason for this became readily apparent to these two subordinates because, a few reasons. Firstly, there was no place to put prisoners. These guys had to act with speed. They had to get under their mission. Everything was very volatile and uncertain.
Right.
It was nighttime. They didn't know exactly where they were. There were only three of them.
They're behind the enemy lines.
They are within the enemy. The enemy is everywhere.
Oh, that's right. Within, yes.
Potentially lurking around every corner.
Brush and
Exactly. Additionally, too, General Maxwell Taylor, the division commander of the 101st Airborne, presumably handed down from an informal divisional level the order to take no prisoners for these very logistical challenges. And so this is, as far as we're concerned, the first instance in which Spiers takes the lives of prisoners of war.
Okay.
And it's not done out of some apparent bloodlust or anything like that. In his mind, it was more a necessity to keep he and his men alive.
So let's break this down for a bit. So the movie presents it like he's this, psycho killer, bloodlust thing. And later in the movie, he says to, I forget to who, but he says to Lipton. And he says maybe, essentially, maybe I want them to think that about me, right? Any truth to that, or is that Hollywood?
So how all of these stories and rumors about Spiers are presented, they're presented the same way in the book as they are in the movie. And really, all of the stories are hearsay. You know, every time in the series that one of his supposed killings or slayings is referenced, it's about guys who are talking about it and essentially saying, hey, I heard from a guy in you know, this company or that company. And it's done rather brilliantly from a cinematic perspective, because it allows the viewers themselves to, in essence, draw the conclusions themselves. Winters, though, was the one who actually suggested to author Stephen Ambrose that the stories be presented that way, because Winters was worried that Spiers might sue Ambrose for telling these stories, and so that was a lot of fun researching kind of this struggle and this argument over historical memory as these guys are in their golden years.
I can really vouch for what you're saying about Major Winters being concerned, because I'm really good friends with one of his very close friends, and I'm not going to drop a name, but he's you know, truly his best friend, and he told me that one of Major Winters' favorite story was that he kept those letters that we now have in a safety deposit box for a while, or a safe, because in case anything happened, because he was concerned about it, even though in the correspondence it seems like Spiers has no problem with any of this stuff, but he was afraid maybe if something happened he would have it in writing, because in these letters Spiers admits to everything pretty much, and so Winters kept those in case something would happen, and I always thought that was pretty interesting. Like when we first started working on the Spiers book, I talked to this gentleman who was really close with Major Winters, and I said, you know, do you got any Spiers stories? And he, that was the first one that came out about Major Winters keeping those letters in a safe place in case something happened. But you know, getting back to the killing the prisoners, you know, that unwritten order from General Taylor is absolutely true, and you know, it's not unique to Spiers. You know, a lot of guys did that, because you know, and one of the things, like when people come in the museum now who may have read the book, or maybe more likely have not read the book and just saw the series or read the book Band of Brothers, you know, they get really judgy with Spiers, like bloodlust and all that kind of stuff, and it's like, you know, if you put yourself in that same situation, think about it. It's the middle of the night. You don't know how the invasion's going yet. You're with a couple other guys. What are you going to do with a bunch of noisy German prisoners? You know, they have hobnails on their boots. You know, they're making all kinds of noise. You know, you're trying to be quiet. You know, put yourself in that situation. As Jared said, it was more of a survival situation. You
and
know?
It makes sense when you consider all those factors. And especially the unwritten order from the division commander.
Yeah,
I mean, come on. So obviously everybody else is doing that if they have to.
And that was because, like he said, where are you going to put prisoners? There's no stockade.
How are you
going to
feed them?
Take them with you.
Yeah.
And until the seaborne guys that were coming in just a few hours. So it was just in those first few hours that was really, there was a lot of that going on. Another thing that happened, you know, after this event, you know, they went to a place called the Marmion Farm, and there was a big fight there. And, you know, there's a bunch of people were you know, landing there, and like I said, there was a fight. There was a bunch of 502nd guys, and by then people started talking. And one of the things they were talking about was there were some other atrocities that were discovered where the Germans were, you know, mutilating people. Guys got stuck in the trees and they got bayoneted and stuff like that. And I just think it was because, you know, the Germans had an order to kill commandos. So the first few paratroopers that may have come down, they may have even thought they were saboteurs or something. And they did that kind of stuff. I mean, there are some horrific things done. Of course, that kind of stuff spreads through the ranks, and you know, you hear about that, and then, you know, there was one account where one of the captains, and I forget which one it was, said, don't take any prisoners at all, you know, and that was at a smaller unit level, you know, so there's all this stuff going on. So when people get a little judgy about what was happening that night, it's like, okay, you weren't there.
Exactly. And we always try to remind people, whatever we're talking about, that wars are ugly and messy, and there's a lot of killing going on in them, and you can't. It's for me. It's like I like to study this stuff, but I try not to pass any judgment on people because I don't know what I would do in that situation.
What was American paratrooper's job on D-Day?
Yeah.
It was to get to your objective, secure one of the 4 causeways or some other objective, but it was also to kill Germans.
Sure, of course, it's a war. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You want to kill them. Absolutely. So the sergeant, though, the sergeant story. What is that story?
So in the earliest hours of June 7th, after they've gone through their initial phases of combat and a lot of these coastal towns have been captured and liberated, one of Spiers's sergeants had dived into some stockpiles of liberated Calvados. And presumably, he was informed that it was cider, and perhaps thought that it was like American cider,
apple cider,
like it was apple cider.
Right, like
And the sergeant quickly became intoxicated. And what we found in our research is that paratrooper intoxication in the combat zone was not anything unusual either, because a lot of these guys were running days on pure adrenaline and liquor. Because this booze is everywhere,
right?
In these French farmhouses and basements, and so it was not uncommon. A lot of the paratroopers called it Hitler tonic, and so so there was a lot of that going on. But this sergeant, and Eric has visited the location where this happened. Perhaps you'd like to take it over, since you can offer even a better visualization.
Yeah. So it was near the village of Vierville.
Okay.
So they had already gone through Saint Marie de Mont, and and also we missed the part where Spiers took out the 4th gun at Brecourt. But we don't have to do the whole book. I mean, that's in the series, and
sure.
that was some amazing combat, and Spiers performed very well there. But there was also another incident where some prisoners were shot that we missed on D-Day.
Okay.
And it's funny, we found it. It was in one of Spiers' medal boxes, because I didn't talk about that either. Ended up getting a lot of Spiers artifacts from the family, and that's a whole nother story. But I have his photos and his medals and a bunch of his artifacts. And in one of the medal boxes, there was this newspaper article that said Weymouth paratroopers killed 13 Nazis. So his body count was 13 on D-Day, just on D-Day.
Just on D-Day.
Now there was the one prisoner that he took. Then there was another incident where he killed 4 guys, but they weren't really prisoners. They more like he just didn't give them the chance to surrender. They probably were going to. So that's 5, and then the ones that he killed at Brecourt too. So he's getting up there in body count.
So these are sent home and reported in the papers, right? And people are very proud of their boys. And,
oh yeah,
indeed, yeah.
So it's not.
You want to talk about the article, or should we get into the killing? I'm sorry, we're kind of jumping around.
No, that's
here,
fine.
So.
We want people to read the book anyway. So.
Yeah.
Well, so this newspaper clipping, which was found among his personal items, it's now within Eric's collection. The basic truth of the matter is that everybody in his hometown knew about his lethality. It wasn't a secret or a mystery.
You mean prior to the war?
During the war.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
during the war. Because he was subsequently interviewed for a radio broadcast, and this newspaper was talking about the radio broadcast. And so in that, he offered details of how and why he ended up claiming all of these Germans that he did. And so suffice it to say, his first 24 hours in Normandy were very eventful.
Yeah.
So much so to the fact that we aren't even sure what order to present them in here to you.
I know.
But yes, that leads us back to the sergeant.
Yeah. So they'd gone from the Marmion farm down towards Brecourt Manor. He fought there, and that's portrayed very well in the series. And then they went through Saint Marie de Mont, and then they went towards a little village called Vierville, and there was a hedgerow very near there, and they were told to stay there. They were ordered to stay there because there were tanks coming up from the various causeways, and they were trying to flush out any Germans that may have been left behind.
Okay.
And so their orders were to stand down, because there's going to be some artillery fire, either from cannons or from these tanks. And so the sergeant that had partaked in some alcohol. And I also have to say that in our research, the veterans that were interviewed by Mark Bando all stated that this particular paratrooper who was drinking never drank. They had never seen him drink before. And he was also old. He was older than most of these guys. Most of these guys were 22, 23 years old. This guy was 29, I believe, or 30. So he was an old man for a paratrooper.
Right.
And so he didn't drink. And so he was drunk that night. And he got insubordinate with Spiers. He said, I want to take the platoon and go out and kill Germans, kill Krauts. That's probably more appropriate of what he was said. But so Spiers said, no, we are ordered to stay here and wait for the tanks and, shoot or capture any Germans that get flushed out. And he's like, you're yellow. And, we don't know the exact words. It varies from...
Words were exchanged, though.
Yeah, and it was pretty severe words, including an F-bomb, which did not get said much in those days, despite what Band of Brothers
Really?
did. Yeah.
Oh, I thought by that point it was everywhere.
Well... It is, but it wasn't. When you use that word, it seems like that's almost fighting words,
Okay.
So anyway, he was getting ready to unholster a gun, and Spiers said, "If you're gonna pick up that gun, you better use it." And I guess Spiers at that point feared for his life. He took his Tommy gun and unslinged it and riddled the guy.
Yeah.
And the accounts that we have said that
he riddled him. So it wasn't just one bullet. It was
he emptied a magazine into him, and the guy that was interviewed that we talked about before, Jumbo, said that he felt the shells hit him from that, out of the casings, and he was that close, and everybody was shocked, and but they also said that they heard that. The bottles breaking. He had a bottle in his paratrooper jacket. So so Spiers ran out to get his commanding officer, Captain Gross, and there happened to be I believe it was a regimental chaplain in the vicinity, and they came over and they talked to the men that saw it happen. They all agreed that Spiers was justified. And so Gross just said, okay, we'll deal with this later. We're not going to deal with it now. It's D-Day +1.
Right.
We need to go do what we need to do. So that's basically what happened. Everybody who saw it agreed that the guy was drunk and he was refusing orders and he was pulling a gun basically on Spiers. So he had it coming. And so, and nothing really happened because a few days later, Captain Gross was killed in an artillery barrage. Right. So, and I'm sure it might have gotten to sink, or I would think he would have heard about it, and I think it was just covered up because this guy's listed as killed in action, battle death. And we got his individual deceased persons files from the archives, which was very difficult to do during lockdown because that's when we wrote this book. But we got it, and that's what it said, and that's why we chose not to reveal the name. Of
the sergeant,
right?
Okay.
So me very well. I some of my slogan. I like to be truthful. I don't like to hide stuff. I don't like to sugarcoat stuff. I don't like any of that. And so I really wrestled with this one. But Jared and a couple other people convinced me maybe it's not our place to reveal his name because he probably, and also historian Mark Bando, he said, he has family out there, and who are we to say, to reveal that? You know what I mean? So we just use the term the sergeant.
The sergeant.
Yeah. I found some of his living family members through some researching, and I thought they have no idea what actually happened to this guy. And I'm not going to break the heart of some 90-year-old brother or sister who thought that their big brother died heroically on D-Day, and
But he
so
died a drunk.
yeah. Well, and so the mixture of the official record says this, contrary to what we indicate, and we just don't want to hurt the family because there was really no good that could come out of us.
And it doesn't help us to know the guy's name anyway.
It doesn't change the story, and we footnoted it and wrote why we did that, and it was. But I really wrestled with that one. I actually lost sleep. I would wake up in the middle of the night saying, "Okay, we got to do it. It's the historical fact."
Yeah.
But then I think about Jared, and he said my grandfather landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, which he did, and he said if I found out he died a dishonorable death, it would crush me. And I was like, man, he's right. And also we had a historian that used to be teaching at West Point, helping us. He did some of our technical stuff, and he said, the official report is he was killed on D-Day. It even says D-Day, and a battle death. And he said, you could maybe even have some issues, like if the family would come after you online or something like that and start arguing with you, and they have the backing of the official record. And we just have interviews from soldiers that were there.
Right.
So
what do they know?
Yeah. Exactly.
All right. So probably my favorite, and we're jumping around here, but again, we want people to get the book and see the whole story all stitched together properly. My favorite scene in Band of Brothers is the attack on Foy and Spiers running across town. Did he really do that, or is that just Hollywood? And what the hell was he doing, and how did this all go?
It did happen, and it largely happened in that way. The film is fairly accurate in that sense. And in my view, there's very little embellishment. Some things are condensed.
Right, sure.
But the circumstances of his mad dash heroics at Foy, January 13th, 1945, are largely indicated by the words and observations of Carwood Lipton.
Okay.
And we looked at his firsthand accounts in various interviews on that and stitched the story together accordingly. Now, one area or one issue that is a little bit contested is the circumstances as to why he took command of Easy Company at that moment, particularly the circumstances surrounding
Lieutenant Dyke.
Supposedly Foxhole Norman Dyke.
Yeah.
Now,
does he get a bad rap? Is that what you're saying?
Some of the Easy Company veterans thought so. Because some of the veterans, including Forrest Guth, insisted that Dyke was actually wounded at Foy, and that is why the attack came screeching to a halt, not because of some sort of indecision or panic under fire. Others insist otherwise.
Clancy Lyle said that too, I think, in his book. Yeah.
But wait a second, there's no record of him receiving a wound?
I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
Not for that. Once again, we were writing this book during lockdown.
Right.
It was hard to get these. It's hard enough to get these individual personnel files to begin with when the world is running normally.
Yeah, right.
And so we offered both perspectives in the book.
Okay.
We said, regardless of whether he was panic-stricken or he was wounded, what followed is still truthful.
Yeah.
And so Spiers runs out upon Winters' orders. As Winters was recounting all of this, he referred to Spiers as a natural killer.
Yeah.
He was the perfect man for the situation.
Yeah, I just want to pause there for a second, because you bring Winters up, and Winters in the movie, he almost goes in himself, and it's Sink who calls him back. But you point out that that's not how it happened. He stopped himself, Winters.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which is that I was happy to hear that, because that scene always kind of bothered me, that he needed to be pulled, because he wasn't a hothead. So I think what they were trying to do is, like, it made him a hothead. It was so frustrating or whatever. But he stopped himself.
Yes.
And he said, no, this isn't your job anymore. Like, you're the whole battalion.
Right.
Not just the Easy Company, right? So and then he turns around, and there's Spiers. Just standing there with like a halo on. It's like,
But and I think the reason cinematically that they did that is, like, you can't, unless they had like some sort of monologue where you could hear Winters's inner thoughts, like, like, don't go out there, like, this isn't your job anymore. It kind of works better from an artistic standpoint, having Sink beckon him back, to explain the situation.
Like maybe in real life he heard Sink's voice in his head.
Exactly. Exactly.
And, so then he sends Spiers in. So now Spiers, how is it? It's not the whole company, is it? It's just a couple platoons.
It's 2 platoons of the company.
Okay. And so he sends Spiers in, and he's supposed to command them and lead them in. But what he does is he runs across the damn village.
Yes.
Right?
They're upon the outskirts of the village at this point. There are Germans within the church building that's nearby. There's a schoolhouse. There's domestic dwellings. And one of Spiers's chief concerns is that in the confusion of the moment, that I Company on their right flank would accidentally start firing into his men. And this is when Spiers embarks on this, run, this iconic run, essentially through enemy lines to link up with I Company, which he does. There's an officer by the name of Roger Tinsley, and Spiers very briefly says, have your men hold their fire. I don't want, any friendly fire being inflicted upon my men. Tinsley waves his hand, orders his men to stop firing. Spiers turns around to return to his platoons, and as he does so, Tinsley is mortally wounded, shot through the chest, hit in the head, and this is one of many close calls that Spiers has. There's at least 2 or 3 accounts in our book where somebody standing right beside him is killed or mortally wounded. And so this guy, and on top of that, he was wounded himself on a number of occasions. So this was a guy who really had 9 lives, and one of them was spent at Foy in January 1945.
And he gets back, and they go in, and then what happens with, was it Tinsley, you said? With his company, do they eventually join them once they get to a safe, okay.
Yeah, everything moved forward in unison. What they were trying to do was some of them were trying to circle around the village to cut off the German tanks that were fleeing at that given moment. And so everything started moving more jointed, from that point forward. And Winters said Spiers was largely to thank for it.
That's amazing, though. I mean, talk about balls, Well, and then what would have happened if he was hit and killed? Then what? Yes.
Well, I was just going to say one of the letters that we have with Spiers, when he's talking about this event, he says, he remembers an 88 shooting directly at him, and he said that got my attention, and they show that in the movie, and it's funny, we also failed to mention that we worked with his family somewhat, his immediate family, and his last wife. He had several wives, but his last wife that he was with the longest, his stepsons, and they were the ones that sent me the photos and some of the really great stuff. But he told me that they watched the series with him, and I'm so jealous of that. I mean, could you imagine watching the series Band of Brothers with Ronald Spiers? But he said during that scene, he looked at him and said, gosh, did I really do that? Because when stuff like that's happening, it's probably just a big blur, so.
Yeah. He sounds like, so what was he like? So if you work with the family, what was he like, in civilian life, personality-wise? What kind of man was he?
That's an interesting story as well, because Jared worked with one side of the family, and I worked with the other side of the family. And the side I worked with, they, their mother married him. I'm talking about his stepsons, and she married him later in life, and they knew he was a retired lieutenant colonel, and they knew he had a career in the military, but they didn't really know much about him. And then the book came out, Band of Brothers, and one of the stepsons, or I guess both of the stepsons, read it, and they started asking him questions. He would dodge questions, and he didn't really talk about it a whole lot. And the other thing that he told them that I thought was interesting, once the series then came out, they started really asking him questions, and he said, and they're like, why don't you remember? He'd say, I don't remember that, I don't remember this. And he said, those guys like Major Winters and Forrest Guth and some of the Easy Company guys, they only fought in combat for 2 years, basically, or and he said I was in basically 3 wars, or at least 2 in combat, and I was in the Army for decades, and he said some things blended together, like maybe some of the parachute jumps from Korea may have blended together.
Sure.
And of course by then he's advancing in age and stuff like that, and he was having some dementia issues later in life, but the thing that I took away most was, or what I was most impressed with, was that all the family members I talked to his great-great-grandson, or his great-grandson also at length. They just said how loving of a grandfather and great-grandfather he was. He doted on the children, and the side of the family that Jared talked to, they didn't even believe that the story, they didn't believe the HBO stories, and I'll let Jared tell that part, because I thought that was real. Uncle Ronnie and all that stuff. There's no way.
So wait, Uncle, this isn't his uncle.
These are his nieces and nephews.
Nieces and nephews. Oh, they called him Uncle Ronnie. Okay,
yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Some of them believed the stories to a large extent, but some were a little bit more suspicious of it, because their memories of him were as a kind, loving, chivalrous, quiet individual who had a deep and abiding respect and love for his family. And understandably, they just thought there's no way that he possibly could have done these things.
Yeah.
And so, there's 2 sides to every story, just like there's 2 sides to every individual. And what I tried to do to perhaps allay some of their fears or suspicions is that we're trying to put your uncle into context. We're trying to understand what combat does to individuals, and
Sure.
the strain that it places on combatants. And really good and decent and heroic people sometimes had to confront these really harsh realities
Sure.
and do things out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
And
Especially if your own life is on the line.
Yes, and so we were really, really happy to work with both sides of the family. They gave us a lot of great genealogical information on one end, and then perspective on the latter portions of his life in the other. And we've just been really pleased with how they have received the book, because a number of them have contacted us, and they've thanked us, and they said, you've given us a fuller perspective of this guy that we knew really well. And so we're really pleased by how
That's got to make you feel good.
Yeah, and it also pleases us because we didn't want to portray him as a villain or a war criminal, and at the same time we didn't want to be practicing hagiography, like hero worship.
Right.
And I'm really pleased with how it turned out, because I think we found, I hope, the perfect middle ground. It shows that good people can sometimes do bad things in the name of a good cause. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the big takeaways.
After the war, what does he do? Does he just go home and kiss his wife and say, "I'm home forever, honey"?
Well, the war bride in England, there was a bit of a issue with that, because she was previously involved with a British soldier who they thought was killed in action, or she thought was killed in action.
Uh-oh.
But actually he was a prisoner of war, and he came back. And Ronald Spiers decided to stay in the Army, and he wanted to stay on jump duty. So he once the 101st Airborne was disbanded, he went into the 82nd Airborne, because that was the unit that was going to stay on jump status. And that would involve taking him and his son and his new wife back to the United States, and she didn't want to go. And then this guy came back who was a prisoner of war, who she was in love with, obviously, before Ronald Spiers. And so the decision was made that the son and the war bride would stay in England, and he would go back, and they got a divorce. And so he went back to the United States with the 82nd Airborne, stayed in the Army, and then he met...
Did he ever see the kid again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have photos. I believe he attended his wedding.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, there's pictures of that. Some kind of a little bit awkward photos, because the POW British guy raised this son as his own, and yeah, I have some pictures of the wedding. Like the family sent me all these photos. It was amazing. I mean, most of the photos were post World War II. There's only a few photographs of him actually in World War II. A lot of them were from Korea and some of his other deployments. But he stayed in the 82nd for a while, and then of course the Korean War breaks out, and he ends up going with the 187th Regimental Combat Team in Korea, he did 2 combat jumps with them. And he went up the ranks, and after that he ended up in Germany. He went to Russian language school and ended up in Germany because he became the governor of Spandau prison. And the way that worked was, the victorious allies would run that prison for a period of time. The French would run it, the British would run it, the Russians would run it, and then the Americans would run it. And they had the famous Nazi war criminals in there. And I always thought it was funny. It's so ironic that the guy who's accused of killing Nazi prisoners ends up guarding the most famous of them. Yeah. And we have some great photos of that. And
of him with the prisoners?
No, just him at the. There's some of like him with the Russians there and all that. He had to deal with the Russians, and there's a really cool story, about him interacting with one of the famous Nazi prisoners. And Jared, you want to tell that story?
Yes, one of the prisoners was Rudolf Hess, one of the key architects of the Third Reich.
Yeah, these aren't like middle management guys. These are like high up guys.
Not in the least. And Spiers did not speak much German, and so he and Hess communicated in somewhat of an indirect way because they would play chess against each other.
Oh, okay.
And so we could have called the chapter Chess with Hess, I suppose.
Second edition.
Yes. But I thought that is just a fascinating snapshot of how this guy's mind works. It's like I'm here communicating in this indirect fashion with my ultimate enemy.
Right.
And at the same time, too, he can speak passable Russian at this moment, and there are opportunities for him to socialize with various Soviet officers. He goes to Christmas parties with them and, things like that, maintaining, professional relations with these people in West Berlin. But at the same time, we can't help but think he's also trying to gain insights on his future potential enemy amidst the Cold War as well.
Now, do you know that, or is that your speculation? Like, did he write that somewhere?
His family suggested that to us.
Okay.
And in fact, Dale Dye, who played Colonel Sink in the series and wrote the foreword for our book and was the military advisor for the series, he drew that same conclusion from some of his research and conversation with Spiers, that this was how this guy operated. He was not only a very agile combat leader, but he was also very sharp analytically and intellectually.
You mentioned Dale Dye. I just looked down and I noticed that at the top while we were doing the show here. How did you get him to do the foreword? You good friends with him?
Well, we had Brad Freeman, the last living Band of Brothers member, write the foreword to Hang Tough, and I didn't want to have him do this one, and so we were thinking maybe one of the actors, maybe the guy that played Spiers. I don't really know the guy who played Spiers,
Matthew Settle.
Yes, but I've been at a lot of events with Band of Brothers actors, and in fact I toured Europe twice with some of the actors, and on one of the tours Dale Dye was on the tour, and I became friends with him, and and Jared actually suggested, he goes, "Hey, Dale Dye, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And because I was going to do another tour with him at one point, so I had all his personal contact when I was starting to do regular, I was going to start doing my own tours, and I was going to possibly enlist him to come along. So I had his personal contact, and Jared said, why don't you ask Dale Dye? And I was like, yeah, when I was on tour with him in Europe, he and I went out to lunch and in St. Mary Glees, and we talked about Spiers, and I could tell he was really into Spiers. And that's another reason why I really wanted to do this book, because when I have done some of the tours over in Europe, there's always someone, I get this question every time. Hey, Eric, let me talk to you. Hey, what is it with Spiers? Did he really do this stuff? Like, I would get that question all the time from people on the tour. Guy. Yeah, absolutely. And I knew Dale Dye was interested in Spiers. I could tell. He liked the conversation. Dale Dye, he will. You can tell when he's enjoying the conversation. Right. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I would imagine.
So I messaged him and I told him what we were doing. He's like, send me some chapters, some sample chapters. So I did. And so I thought, well, he said, yeah, I'd like to do it. I like the writing. And I was waiting for him to hit me with a fee or something, because usually, stars like that. And he said, no charge. I want it to be a good book.
Nice.
And then I also said, what do you think of the writing? And he said, the research is there, but drop the adjectives. You don't have anybody to impress. The research is there. Tone it down a little. And he went on this whole big thing about, and I thanked him because it was sound advice.
Sure.
And he said, I want this to be successful. And so we did. We dialed it back a little bit. And the funniest thing about that was, and here's another thing that a lot of people don't know about Dale Dye is he's a great writer himself. He's written several books. And when I got his forward, I was like, oh my gosh, this is really great.
This guy knows how to write.
He knows how to write, and he had more adjectives than Jared and I ever put in there. It was fun. It was like he was trying to outdo us.
He wanted all the adjectives for himself. That's why.
No, but he wrote a great forward. I thank him, and it was a great fit for this. And he tells a great little story about being with Spiers at the premiere over in France.
But when he says, no charge, I want this to be a great book, that's a sign that you're onto something you're supposed to do. Because, if it was like, this kind of sucks, but these guys need me, all right, $5,000 or whatever. But if you're onto something, people, they come out of the woodwork and they offer to help, and they go, I just want to see it work. And I know this because it happens with me. So that's a good sign when somebody does that for you.
He sent me the nicest message. I sent him a copy of the book, and I said, Captain Dye, I don't have your address, and I want to send you a copy of the book. And anyway, he sent it to me, and he wrote me the nicest email. I wish I had it. I'd
pull it up and read it. Yeah, you should.
About congratulations. This is a story that needed to be told, and you're doing a great job. And he was really nice, and I really appreciated that.
And that's got to be nice coming from him too.
Oh, yeah,
of all people.
I'm a big fan of Dale Dye.
Yeah, no, me too. He's awesome. And he did like all of Spielberg's World War II movies, right?
Yeah.
Private Ryan and Band of Brothers. And did he do the Pacific?
Yes.
Yeah.
He did?
And Platoon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, not just Spielberg stuff.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, guys, good job on the book. Congratulations. Thank you for coming on the show to talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is called Fierce Valor, the true story of Ronald Spiers and his band of brothers. And where can they get it?
They can get it at my website, GettysburgMuseumofHistory.com. And I have to plug...
Can they get it for the historian? Is it there yet?
I'm not sure about that, but it's in my museum store also. And I have to plug the special edition. We did a special edition book plate that was signed by Brad Freeman. We paid him to sign cards, and it has a piece of Bill Garnier's parachute. So Bill Garnier had a reserve parachute, and he gave several pieces of it to different collectors over the year. Cool. I know several guys that have it, and I have a piece of it. And so because it's just a piece, it's not a full parachute, we made little swatches and just took a small section of it. And we put it on the card. So you can get a special edition signed by Brad Freeman, the last living band of brother, with a piece of Bill Garnier's parachute. Bill fought with Ron Spiers at Breakport.
Gonorrhea.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, man, that's awesome. I, though, have a signed copy from Erik Dorr and soon Jared Frederick.
Indeed, my pleasure.
That is more valuable than anything, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Thank you guys very much for coming on, and good luck with the book. I hope it brings you great success.
Thank you for having us. Hope we can do it again.
Maybe there will be a movie one day based off of your book.
The Carentan chapter would be a nice, nice fill in the gap.
Oh, see,
something
we
the
didn't
Band
even
of Brothers
talk about
doesn't
that.
show.
Oh, see, very nice. Okay, very good. Well, then that people have to get the book now. Ladies and gentlemen, go get the book, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening. All right. That's it, guys.
Excellent.
Well done.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.
Lovely.